Okay, thank you all for being here. This is December 7th, Sunday, December 7th. This is the 84 years since the attack on Pearl Harbor. And there aren't many people around now who remember the attack on Pearl Harbor and are still able to tell you about it. So I want to tell you not only about the attack on Pearl Harbor, but some of the history that went between Pearl Harbor and Midway. I won't discuss Midway because that's another whole subject in itself. But this is leading up to Midway and how Midway was the turning point of the war. So this first 6 months, we lost just about everything. And most people forget it. We forget our defeats. We always remember our great victories. But it's time to remember those who gave their all and fought against terrible odds, and the mistakes we made and the mistakes they made. So unlike previous times when I've covered just Pearl Harbor and the Niihau incident and the second attack on Pearl Harbor, this time I'm also going to include the battles that were fought in the Pacific leading up to the Battle of Midway. So I'm going to cover the first attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, 84 years ago. I was there, a 7-year-old boy. And by the way, since that time, actually, I have visited many of the places that are covered in this lecture. I have, been to Alaska, Japan, South Korea. I've been to the Philippines, to Hong Kong, to Malaya and Singapore, and to Midway Island. Not many people have been to all those, and I was one of the very few people who went to Midway Island. That's a story in itself. But I will tell about the main attack and then the Niihau incident, which is just a minor thing that happened, but because I was a child there, we heard about the Niihau incident, and we used to talk about it in school, and it did have some impact on the treatment of Japanese in the United States after the attack. Actually, the Japanese, I say, conquered one of them. There was one Japanese pilot who happened to have all the guns. So I say he captured the Hawaiian Islands. Then I'll cover the second attack on Pearl Harbor, which occurred 3 months later, and that was kept secret. So many people have not heard about it at all. But it was kept secret. So many things were kept secret. But we kids knew about them all because we were there and we talked about everything. And the second attack on Pearl Harbor had an impact on the Battle of Midway. And I'll cover the key battles between Pearl Harbor and Midway. Starting out myself, I was this little guy here, and this is our family and our house in Honolulu. This is taken a few months before the attack on Pearl Harbor, and we lived by the beach. And this, you can't see it too well, or can't from my angle, but this little guy here is me running around on the beach with the outrigger canoe. I remember they took me for rides in that outrigger canoe. Well, On December 7th, my brother and I took our BB guns and went out on the beach shooting crabs. Now, these days, the idea of a 7-year-old, myself, an 8-year-old, my brother, out with BB guns, unsupervised, would be considered child endangerment. But anyway, we were out there with our BB guns shooting crabs on the beach when my mother came running out, screaming for us to come home. She was all excited, and so we came home, and there was a lot of confusion, but the radio we had on our table was saying that the Japanese are attacking Pearl Harbor. This is the real McCoy, the real thing. And they would describe what a Japanese paratrooper would look like. And my brother and I thought, hey, we'll take our BB guns and go out and look for Japanese parachutists. And my mother thought that was a pretty dumb idea. So my father drove into the Kodak office. He was second in command in Kodak there. And he went into the office, and no one else was there. It was Sunday. So he went in and went up on the roof, and he could see the anti-aircraft fire over Pearl Harbor. And he suddenly heard a pounding on the door. So he went back down, and it was a U.S. Army officer. And he said that the Army is taking over the Kodak office for its film processing. And I just said, okay, I guess you're taking over. So my dad let him in and showed him around the chemicals they had and the facilities they had. And we did a lot of film processing in those days. And they heard another knocking on the door. So my father went to the door and opened it, and it was a Navy officer. And he said the U.S. Navy is taking over this film processing thing. And my dad said, well, you might as well discuss it with the Army, who's already here. So my dad introduced them themselves, and then he came back home and told us what he had seen. Well, we had heard a few planes flying over our house, but we were inside, and I didn't really go outside and look at them, but we heard them. And about 10 o'clock or so, we heard a noise outside our house, and I went out to look. And it was an Army tank with a bunch of several truckloads of soldiers. And one load of soldiers got out and went down to the beach. Okay. So about this time, it was time to go back in the house. And we went back in the house, and my mother was making lunch, and we were sitting down at the table, and suddenly I heard bum, 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 machine gun fire right outside our door. And we didn't know what it was. My mother was so scared that she was carrying a bowl of peas out for her lunch, and she spilled the peas all over the table. I remember that. But my dad and my brother then, he was the older boy. He was 8.5 years old. Golly, he was an old boy. So they went out to see what the shooting was about, and they found that the Army troops that had got off the truck had set up a machine gun nest, not quite in our backyard, but very close to our house. And they were just testing it out to make sure it fired. Yeah, this was the a normal thing to do after you set up a machine gun nest, and you think that this was a probable beach for a landing. It turned out that we were on a very nice beach that would split the islands in two, and it seemed a likely place for a Japanese landing. But all we had there for a long ways was one machine gun nest. So there was very little that could do to stop Japanese, but we didn't know that. So we went back in the house, and we spent the rest of the day just listening to the radio. But enough of me. Let's talk about what happened to the real attack on Pearl Harbor. The first wave came through at 7:40. It was picked up by a U.S. radar station at Opama Point up there. And they saw the planes coming in, and they had only a commercial telephone booth down the road a little ways to call it in from. They didn't have proper communications with the defenses. And so they went down to the telephone booth and called in and said that they had planes coming in. And it turned out we had B-17s coming in from San Francisco, coming in to land at Hickam Field. And the officer on duty figured it was just the B-17s coming in from California. So he didn't do anything. A lot of people say, well, we should have responded to the radar attack, to radar pickup. Well, we really couldn't. That guy was on a payphone to the U.S. Army, and the U.S. Army really had no connection with the Navy except at the higher levels. So they couldn't have called it in. And next of all, we're lucky that they couldn't call it in, because assuming they could have got to the Navy headquarters, what would the Navy have done? Well, their normal plan in those things was to signal all ships in harbor sortie, okay, thinking that the Japanese Navy was coming in to attack and get all the ships out of the harbor. But this was not a naval attack. This was an air attack. And if the ships had been able to get out, maybe one of them would have been sunk in the channel going into Pearl Harbor. And if you sank a ship in the channel, Pearl Harbor would have been blocked. You can't get a ship out of a channel very easily, and it would take a long time, and Pearl Harbor would have been out of action. So we're very lucky that that information was not passed on. You have probably heard of the American P-40s that got off from Awila Airport. They had gone there, I think there were just two of them, but there were actually, we always hear about two of them that got up there and they both end up getting shot down. But there actually were 14 U.S. airplanes that did get off the ground, but we were pretty well massacred. But it was a good show of force, and we shot down a couple of Japanese airplanes. But we lost about everything. They came in, and the first attack was on Pearl Harbor, and the second attack came at 8:50, and that's the one that I probably heard because that star is where my house was. So they came over us while we were having a little bit about 8:50, 9 o'clock or so, when we were in our house listening to the radio. So we were indoors and didn't see it. And they came on in and hit all our fields and pretty well destroyed us. That's what they did to Battleship Row. All our big battleships there burning. The U.S. losses in that attack, we lost 2,403 killed. The Japanese lost 64 killed. We lost 1,198 wounded. They lost 1 captured. We had 4 battleships sunk, 4 battleships damaged severely. We lost, and the Japanese didn't lose any ships. We had 188 aircraft destroyed. The Japanese lost 29. We lost 159 aircraft damaged. They lost 74 damaged. Well, it turns out that those battleships were sunk right here in the main depot, the main repair depot for the Pacific Fleet. And the depot itself was not touched. Now, this is a picture of a dry dock. And this here is the remains of a destroyer that was burned out. He fell over on this other destroyer. And this was a battleship in the back that did suffer a bomb hit, but it was easily repaired. This dry dock was flooded to stop the fires. So that's why it's flooded. But you can see it was a complete Japanese victory. And they say, why wasn't there, the U.S. was lucky. The aircraft carriers were not in Pearl Harbor. And the failure to respond to radar warning was fortunate to us because the ships could have been sunk in the channel. The Japanese failure to launch a third wave. They had 8 battleships sunk, damaged or sunk, and 7, all except the Arizona, were repaired and fought again. The repair installations were undamaged. Fuel and damage and ammo storage was not touched. Well, they weren't the target. The Japanese didn't. The Japanese thought of major ships. They were after the battleships and the aircraft carriers and the cruisers and all that. They didn't think so much about the ground installations, the repair facilities, the storage facilities, all of which were crucial. Why no third wave? The U.S. carriers were not in port, but he didn't know where the U.S. carriers were. The American carriers actually were far away, unable to interfere. The Enterprise was delivering fighters to Wake Island. So it was actually pretty far out. Wake Island, I'll talk more about Wake Island later, but they were delivering fighters to Wake Island, so they didn't have any fighters on board anymore. They delivered them to Wake Island. So they couldn't have done anything if they were there. Lexington was delivering aircraft to Midway Island. Most of those were float planes. And so the float planes were not much of a danger to the Japanese fleet. But Admiral Nagumo didn't know that. The Saratoga was in San Diego boarding aircraft. It was in San Diego. It was nowhere near the place. And the Yorktown Ranger and Wasp were with the Atlantic Fleet. Now, the Japanese had attacked with 6 aircraft carriers. That's a good one to remember because it was critical later. Because at Midway, they only had 4. And why? And that was a big reason for the Battle of Midway. Admiral Nagumo had lost 29 planes, most on the second wave. They had faced a storm of anti-aircraft fire. In those days, the planes were flying quite low, and anti-aircraft was quite effective. On the first attack, we were surprised, and the guns weren't manned. As a matter of fact, the Army anti-aircraft was in warehouses that they promptly put into action. By the time the second wave came, they faced a storm of anti-aircraft fire. And if they launched a third wave, he'd lost 29 planes. That's a pretty heavy thing if you were going to continue that for any length of time. We used to have a rule of thumb that if you lost 10% of your planes, you couldn't continue the operation. You just couldn't do it. And the Japanese had lost a little less than 10%. If they went back, they were sure to lose a lot more. So the third had serious losses. He had been told to attack Pearl Harbor, and his fleet was low on fuel. So he ordered the fleet to return to Japan and left all the storage facilities and shipbuilding things all untouched. Now, to show you a little bit, I go by maps. I don't know whether you do or not, but I go to maps and try to think about these things. The Japanese came in out of the north. They faced a big storm coming down, which actually helped hide them. And they launched the attack. And on the return, there's Midway. They went way around Midway as if Midway was a dangerous spot. Well, the only plane up there, other planes up there were a few float planes, and the USS Lexington had just dropped those off. And if they had gone straight from Oahu back to Japan, they would have been able to hit Midway, and they would probably have picked up the USS Lexington on the way. But they didn't. They took a very cautious route, even though he was somewhat low on fuel, he said. He had enough for his diverted plan. I think that's what they planned originally. They didn't know that they were going to be so successful. But anyway, it was caution. I like to say they didn't have the spirit of attack. I'm a believer in the spirit of attack. But they did send some ships over to Wake Island and attacked the next day on the 8th of December. Now, I said that the which one was it? One of them was delivering fighters to Wake Island. We were building a base there. And it had been first started as a seaplane base for the China Clipper passenger plane. It was a float plane that would go from California all the way to Wake Island. They would refuel at Oahu, then they'd go to Wake, and then they would go to they would refuel at Wake, and then they would go to the Philippines. And I actually got onto one of the Philippine clippers for a few minutes when I was there. I didn't mention I was born in the Philippine Islands, so I was actually there and actually got to take a little. I was on board just got on board and looked around and got my picture taken on the ship. But Wake Island put up they had delivered about 500 Marines, and the 500 Marines did a great defense against the first ships that came in. They actually were hit first by, it's not that they didn't know the attack was coming, but they didn't have radar. And Japanese planes came in and destroyed most of the fighters that had been just delivered to Wake Island. They destroyed them on the ground. There were only 2 that were left serviceable. I think they had been in the air at the time. And they sank one Japanese ship, and the Marine artillery that had been put on the island. The Marines played it cautiously. Well, they were tricky. Cautious is the wrong word. This was tricky. They did not fire back when the Japanese ships came in and fired at them. They just stayed quiet. And the Japanese finally tried to put some boats ashore to take the place. Now, they didn't have proper landing craft. They had what we would call whale boats that they would bring in. And when they came in close and they let off their whale boats to go into shore. And when they're close to the shore, the Marines opened up on them. And they killed the Japanese who were trying to attack and severely damaged some of the Japanese ships. So the first attack was driven off. And the Japanese were infuriated by that first attack's failure. So later, they came back and reattacked with a much stronger force. And this time they plastered the island with artillery before coming in. And then they landed at night. And without radar, the Marines were kind of helpless. And suddenly they found the Japanese were on the island. And the Japanese captured Wake Island. And then there were 2 groups of people on the island. There were the Marines, what was left of them, and there were the contractors who were trying to build the airfield and all the facilities. And the contractors, of course, had helped the Marines. They had sort of joined up right at the moment. It was time to fight. So they had taken up guns and fought for the Marines. Well, the Japanese considered them guerrillas. They were civilians, not in uniform, fighting, and they had no protection under the Geneva Convention. Not that anyone cared too much about that. So after keeping them for a while, the Japanese took all the contractors out on the beach and shot them all. A few of the Marines were taken back to China, and some of them survived the war as prisoners in China. So there were a few survivors, but not many of that whole group. And the contractors were all shot. Terrible thing. I later was on Wake Island, and I got to go around, and not very many people go to Wake Island, let's face it. I was I got there because I had aircraft troubles and had to land. I was looking for a piece of dry land and got to Wake Island that's another story in itself. But the defense of Wake Island was a great story for the Marines. They fought hard. So the Japanese went back to Wake Island. Now, I'm going to talk then about the Niihau incident. Now, the Japanese knew that some of their planes were likely to be damaged, and some of them might not get back to the carrier. So their plan said that there was this little island of Niihau, and they said it was uninhabited, and if any planes were damaged and couldn't get back to the ships, to the carriers, they were to crash land on Niihau, and a Japanese submarine would come by and pick them up. So that was the plan. Well, there was a Japanese plane hit. He had a hole in his wing, and he was draining fuel out. So he knew he couldn't make it back to the carrier. So he said, okay, this is time to go to Niihau. So he flew to Niihau and crash landed on it. This is the island Niihau, and the pilot of that plane, Nishihachi. And Japanese were a little bit wrong. It was not uninhabited. It was owned by a man named Mr. Robinson. And Robinson, he must have been, I don't know him who he was, but he must have been very wealthy. He had bought the island. It was his island, and he wanted to keep it as preserving history. So he tried not to let other people on the island. But he did there were 4 Japanese on the island, and the rest were Hawaiians. And so Nishihachi crash landed on an island they thought was deserted, but he did a wheels up landing on the rough land, nicest place he could find. But he came at the end of his crash landing, he ended up right in front of Nalikaono. And Nalikaono was outside his house, and along comes this airplane. And the Japanese pilot was pretty well shook up over the landing. I guess he was, it must have been pretty violent. But Taliono came out, and he didn't like the looks of it, but he didn't know anything about the attack. But while the Japanese was still pretty dazed by what had happened, Taliono took the Japanese pistol and went through the airplane and got his papers. It were maps and instructions, various kinds, and some codes and things. And then, and he didn't give those back. And he couldn't, Italiano, could not speak Japanese. So he called, well, they went to a friend's house, the Shintai, and because the Japanese could speak Japanese to him. So, well, I guess Shintai came out to them, to Caliano's house. But anyway, the two Japanese spoke to each other for a while, and Shintai looked very worried, and he didn't say a thing, and went back to his house and locked himself in and didn't come out. Well, the Hawaiians still didn't know what was going on, but they had an uninvited guest, so they had something of a little luau there, and a little party for him. And in the middle of the party, someone had a battery-powered radio receiver, and they got it on, and they listened to the news, and they found out about the attack on Pearl Harbor. So they couldn't really talk to the Japanese pilot, so they put him up in the home of the Haradas, which were another Japanese couple, and they put a guard outside the door to watch things, and the Japanese pilot could talk to the other Japanese there and talk for a while. And, well, the Haradas, after a day or so of this, the guard on the door got less and less interesting for the Hawaiians to do. And finally, they had a 17-year-old boy who was sent there to guard this house. And the Haradas and the Japanese pilot came out and talked to him, and then overpowered him. And then they went to Robinson's house, because the guy who owned the island did have a house there, and they broke into it, and he had a shotgun. So he had a shotgun there, and they also found the Japanese pilot's pistol. And so they now had the only guns on the island. So I say they captured the island. But the Japanese pilot wanted those papers back. He knew the papers had been taken. He went back to his plane and looked around the plane. There were no papers near his plane. So he and the Haradas burned his plane. And they took the machine guns out of the wings. And this is the way they burned it. Oh, he tried to get on the radio and call the fleet, but he got no answer. So now he and the Haradas were looking seriously for the papers. I'm going to be running overtime, I can tell already. So I hope, if anyone needs to leave, they can, but we're not closing until 7. But the Japanese threatened to kill everybody on the island until they found those papers. Well, they got so argumentative that there was one big Hawaiian, and he, Ben and Ella Kanahali, he was a big man, and his wife was there too, and they were having a bitter argument with one of the Japanese being one of the Haradas being the interpreter. And I don't know what they were arguing about, but it was a bitter argument. And at one point, the Japanese pilot passed a shotgun over to Mr. Harada. And while he was doing that, the big Hawaiian attacked the little Japanese. Well, the Japanese grabbed his pistol, but his wife, Ella, grabbed his pistol arm. And it was a small caliber pistol, and the Japanese was shooting at the big Hawaiian who was coming in on him, and he hit the Hawaiian 3 times. That was interesting because later on, we kids had how kids make up rules and things. One of them was never shoot a Hawaiian more than twice. It might make him mad. So the big Hawaiian picked up the Japanese pilot and threw him against a stone wall. And his wife, Ella, picked up a big stone and bashed his brains in. So that was the end of that. The Harada, who had the gun, shot himself with the shotgun and committed suicide. So that was the end of the occupation of the island of Niihau. But it didn't end there because it had quite a lot of impact. The Japanese pilot has a monument in his hometown because he died in battle. The Japanese man who went home, remember that one of them just went home and locked his door? Well, he was interned, then released, and he later became a U.S. citizen. The Harada helped the Japanese pilot commit suicide. The big Hawaiian who threw the Jap into the stone wall received the Purple Heart. Well, he got injured in action. He was wounded in action, and he got a Presidential Medal of Merit. His wife, who had grabbed his gun and then bashed his head in with a rock, got no recognition. I guess that's what happened in those days. Yeah. But the help given by the Japanese residents, these 2 people, and the third one who just went into his house and hid, was partly the reason that the U.S. had for then locking up 110,000 Japanese Americans. So a thing done against, this one man had a influence on 110,000 Japanese Americans being locked up. He was the only traitor to the Japanese Americans, but he was the cause and interment of thousands. And that's one of the bad things that we have in our history. Many of those 110,000 were American citizens, jailed without any crime, without anything. And they were kept jailed for most of the year of the war. And they lost their properties, and that was a bad scene for America. Now, you probably haven't heard about the second attack on Pearl Harbor, unless you've been with me before. But it was 3 months, 3 months later, come on now, it doesn't work. 3 months later, this is the flying boats they used. They used 2 of them. The idea was they would fly them from the Marshall Islands to French frigate shoals, where they would take off on a night mission and fly over Pearl Harbor again and see if the American carriers were in Pearl Harbor. It was going to be night, but they figured they could still see the carriers if they were in Pearl Harbor. And they each carried a couple of bombs, but not much. And they were, of course, they went to the French frigate Shoals, which wasn't much of anything. That's French frigate Shoals. But it had an area here where you could, it was protected from waves, and the Japanese put a submarine there full of aviation fuel. And the two Japanese float planes flew out there, landed in this lagoon, and were refueled and took off for Honolulu, for Hawaii. And they were supposed to get a weather report from a Japanese submarine. Well, no one ever knows whatever happened to that Japanese submarine, but it did not give a weather report. And that was very important because it turned out that we had one of the worst storms that we have had in Honolulu at the time. It was pouring rain. And while we picked up the Japanese planes on radar, now we had radar, and we were all alerted for it. And the Japanese planes came over, and well, we knew they're up there, and we scrambled a few fighters, couldn't find them. And the Japanese came over Pearl Harbor, and well, looking at their path, there were two of them. This one came down, and he turned in there, and he couldn't really find anything in the middle of the rain, so he dropped his bombs into the channel here in front of Pearl Harbor and did no damage at all. And then he flew on out. We were firing a lot of anti-aircraft, but we were just firing at the sound and all that. We didn't have radar directing anti-aircraft. We didn't have any of that. But it was pretty hot out there for the Japanese. You know, I'm sure they had shells going off all around them, but they didn't get hit. But the second one came in, and he couldn't find Pearl Harbor either. So he turned out this way and dropped his bombs, and then they both departed, and they flew back to Kwajalein. Now remember I had been living down here? Well, sometime after this attack, I moved up to that place there. And so I was very close to the second attack place. Well, after the bombs had been dropped, and they blew out some windows in some houses, but they didn't do any other damage. The Army went out, and my house was there, and the bombs he dropped were right there. And when I got there some months later, my friends took me out to show me, kids find out everything. We'd found the bomb crater, and this was the bomb crater with the U.S. Army troops looking for any information they could get out of it. I suppose they found some shrapnel or something. But that bomb crater was still there, and I went and looked at the bomb crater. So that was the last part I had there. But the USA had been alerted to the danger of seaplane raids. We had never thought of that. So we sent a destroyer out to the French frigate Shoals. That must have been the most boring assignment any destroyer ever had to sit at French shoals and make sure the Japanese didn't refuel planes there. Well, then the raid was kept secret because we didn't know if the planes had got back to the islands where they'd come from, and didn't want the Japanese to know what had happened. Actually, both planes got back to the Kwajalein, and they later fought in the war. The Japanese tried to use the same plan 2 months later in May 1942. They wanted to locate the U.S. warships, particularly the carriers, before the attack on Midway Island. But they found the French frigate shoals were being patrolled by a U.S. destroyer, and that was not a place to refuel the planes. So they canceled it. So they didn't get recon of Pearl Harbor before the Battle of Midway. They would have discovered that our carriers had left. And therefore, our carriers surprised the Japanese at Midway. So that was how much it affected, but we kept it all secret. That's why most people don't even know about this second attack. But let me go on to the other things that were going on in the Pacific. This is from Pearl Harbor to Midway. Again, I'm going to be running over time. If anyone has to leave, go ahead and leave. Oh, there are? Oh, boy. At 6. Okay, I'm on 5. I can still have an hour. Okay. The next 6 months were 6 months of Japanese victories. And on December 10th, I myself had not put them all in chronological sequence. So partly, I had heard of all these battles, but which one occurred before which, I wasn't sure of. So I went and did some research and put them chronologically up here for you. The Japanese, while some were attacking Pearl Harbor, the Japanese sent a landing party to Malaya to land on the coast of Malaya, which they did, and they didn't have any carriers with them. They were all in Pearl Harbor, but they were landing their troops on the Malayan coast. And the British, of course, heard about it. They were in Singapore. And so they had 2 ships there, the heavy cruiser Repulse and the battleship Prince of Wales, which was one of Britain's best warships. And so the Japanese troop ships unloading supplies. So the Prince of Wales and the Repulse sailed up to engage the Japanese ships unloading the troops and whatever escorts they might have. But as luck would have it, as the Repulse and the Prince of Wales were sailing up there, there was a Japanese air raid of land-based bombers coming to hit Singapore. And this air raid for Singapore found the Repulse and the Prince of Wales, and they attacked and sank both ships. At the time, we had often said that, well, when Billy Mitchell sank the Ostfriesland, the German battleship after World War I in a test, well, the Ostfriesland had been at anchor. It was not moving. It was not manned. It had no anti-aircraft guns. So they said that an airplane couldn't sink a battleship while it's at sea and fully armed and all that. Well, the sinking of the Repulse and the Prince of Wales showed that aircraft could sink warships at sea when they're fully armed and ready to fight. But the Prince of Wales and the Repulse went down, and then the Japanese landed on Malaya, and the British were not prepared for a landing on the Malayan Peninsula that then comes down to Singapore. And the Japanese came down through the Malayan jungles, and the British went out to meet them. The British went out on roads, and the Japanese went off the roads and into the jungles and attacked the British troop convoys from the jungles, and the British were losing step by step and were forced back into the, yes, anyone else who needs to leave, sure can. It's 5 o'clock now. So I told you about the fall of Wake Island, and then Hong Kong. The Japanese landed there was a British colony at the time, Hong Kong, and there's the mainland part is called Kowloon, and there's the big island, Hong Kong Island, and a nice harbor there in the middle. And there were very few British soldiers there, and they had really no hope of anyone coming to their rescue, but they put up a good fight. They retreated to Hong Kong, and the Japanese again attacked during the night when the British couldn't see them coming, and they were on the island in significant numbers and overcame the British resistance, and the British surrendered. Then one of the atrocities of the war, and because I was in Hong Kong and talked to the people there who had survived this thing, the Japanese came in and killed all the people in the hospitals, and they raped the nurses, killed them, and threw their bodies in the trash heap. So I learned about that from my people in Hong Kong. So that was one of the things they did. So after Hong Kong, there are two buttons here. Then Singapore fell on February 15th. The British had been driven back to Singapore. They could have held out longer, but the British general decided to surrender, and he did, and the great numbers of British soldiers were taken prisoner. And if you've seen the bridge on the River Kwai, they were in a pretty tough prison camps. Then the Battle of the Java Sea. I want to show you a map of this because they tell you a little about where these places are. So this is the Java Sea down here, and over here is the Coral Sea. We'll talk about the Coral Sea a little bit later. But now here's the Philippines and Vietnam over here, and Malaya with Singapore down here. So the Japanese had landed here on Malaya and come down and taken Singapore. But the Battle of the Java Sea was, we and the British and actually the Dutch, previously the Dutch had quite a navy. Through history, you can hear about the Dutch Navy, but they didn't have very much then. They had a couple of ships and a cruiser and things like that. And the Dutch admiral was in charge, but he didn't speak English. And so the transmissions between the ships were difficult and sometimes were completely misunderstood. And the Dutch admiral did have the spirit of attack, but he was facing much greater forces than his. And so he attacked into a very strong Japanese surface force that was in there in the Battle of the Java Sea. And after that, they went to the battle of what was left, shall I say. There was a U.S. heavy cruiser, the Houston, that had been heavily damaged, and it had lost its aft gun batteries due to a bomb hit before. But by golly, they were going to fight. So they went into the Sunda Straits there, and there they encountered another Japanese fleet. And the Houston and about all the rest of the ships that were left went down in that battle just a few days after the Battle of the Java Sea. So effectively, all Allied ships were sunk at that time. So we were in a zero condition. And the Japanese were running rampant around. So going back to my other slide, the Battle of Java Sea was a complete disaster. It was a brave fight, but we lost. And then the Battle of Bataan, the fall of Bataan. I went to the Bataan Peninsula in the Philippines, and there the Japanese had landed in the north of the Philippines, in the Malian Gulf, and MacArthur made some serious mistakes. MacArthur, the original general before MacArthur, was convinced that he should build defenses around Manila and Bataan Peninsula and the island of Corregidor. MacArthur came in, he says, nah, you're a defeatist. So he said, when the attack came on the Philippines, we made a number of serious mistakes. MacArthur did get the word that he first of all he changed his basic plan. Instead of restocking Bataan and Corregidor with supplies, he said, we'll go out and meet the Japanese where they land. So he was going to be aggressive there, but again, not so smart. Well, anyway, right after the attack on Pearl Harbor, of course, he got messages saying that that the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor, and so they expected the Japanese attack on the Philippines to come as soon as dawn struck. So he had all our fighters take off to patrol at dawn. Well, the Japanese planes were coming from Taiwan, Formosa, the island, Taiwan, now it's called. And in that morning, there was fog in Taiwan, and the Japanese planes couldn't take off in the morning. So they waited until the fog lifted enough so that they could take off. So they were delayed by a couple of hours getting airborne. Well, meanwhile, the U.S. planes are up there orbiting the Philippines, and nobody came. So now they're all running out of fuel. So they all landed. And what happens next? Suddenly there's Japanese airplanes there. And virtually all our planes were destroyed on the ground. And I understand there was a meeting, and MacArthur was talking to his staff, and he was saying, well, we're going to do this with our Air Force, we're going to do that. And someone said, General, you have no Air Force. It's gone. So, and he sent his men then up. There was one road going up to where the Japanese were landing in Lanalian Gulf, just as he had planned. Well, you have a long road and you don't have air cover. So the Japanese planes were shooting up our trucks trying to go north, and the Japanese landed, and they were pretty good in the jungle, and they came around us and attacked from the jungle, bypassing our defenses, and we were driven back. MacArthur did declare Manila an open city, which means he would not defend it, and the Japanese would not therefore attack it. So Manila itself was not attacked. But the Japanese now came down, and the Americans fell back on their original plan to defend Bataan. But the supplies weren't there. They had been taken up north on this fateful convoy going north. So there were no supplies there. And the men fought in Bataan for a long time until they ran out of ammunition and food and water. And finally, the General King surrendered the people in Bataan. And then came the infamous Bataan Death March. Now, before that, though, the U.S. forces actually outnumbered the Japanese, because we had a Filipino constabulary that fought with us. And together we outnumbered the Japanese, and yet they beat us. We don't hardly admit that, but we were beaten by smaller numbers. And we were driven back into Bataan without any supplies, and we finally surrendered. Well, the Japanese figured that it was 62 miles up to a railroad station where we'd take the prisoners up to the prison camps. That they used some abandoned U.S. Army posts up there as prison camps. But the American soldiers and the Filipinos that were fighting with us were already tired, wounded, and starved, and without any water. And the Japanese said, oh, you can march 62 miles. So they started this 62-mile march as prisoners, without any water, without any food. And the Japanese were absolutely brutal. They killed all the wounded. And if you couldn't walk, if you fell down, you were killed. And at the Japanese, well, 400 Americans died. 400 Americans died on that march. But the Filipinos, the Japanese treated them even worse. There was one bridge across a small river that they crossed, and they hadn't had water in a long time. And the Filipinos broke and ran for the water to try to get a drink. And the Japanese machine gunned them as they were trying to get a drink and killed hundreds of Filipinos. As a matter of fact, the Filipinos' losses were between 12,000 and 18,000 men killed on the march. Good heavens, that many people killed on the march. And then many more died in the camps later on. But that was the infamous Bataan Death March. Now, we did, on May 6th, MacArthur, who they called Dugout Doug, because he went inside the caves in Corregidor and stayed in the caves in Corregidor and never came out to see what was going on. And most of his guns were pointed toward the shore, toward Bataan. They thought the Japanese would come down to, and when he saw columns of troops marching along the roads, he ordered our artillery to fire upon the marching troops. No, they were our prisoners being marched up on the. So, and then the guns had not been placed. It was an old-fashioned fort. It was open to the sky, except for the tunnels where Dugout Doug stayed. And so the Japanese fighters could attack our guns that were behind revetments, but they were open to the air. So that was a failure. And Dugout Doug, well, it turned out that he was one of the very few people who knew that we had broken the Japanese code. And actually, he was ordered by Roosevelt that they were afraid that if he was captured, they might get him to tell them anything, and including that we had broken the codes. So he was told to get out, and he did, but he took his wife and his the ama to take care of their children with him on the submarine as they left. So while MacArthur gets a lot of good stories, those of us who were there don't think very highly of MacArthur. Dugout Doug. So now we did have one, darn, these buttons are the same. Doolittle raid on Tokyo. Yes, the Doolittle raid came in there, and WASP launched 14 B-25s off their deck and surprised the living daylights out of the Japanese, who had no expectation of an attack. Actually, we did very little damage to Japan, and we lost all 14 of the B-25s, and most of the crew, some did get back. Doolittle and some of his men, they all had their own stories, but wow. Some of them marched great long distances before they got back. And the Japanese were extremely brutal to any of the Chinese villages. Any of the Chinese villages that helped any of the survivors, they would just kill everybody in the town. That was their answer to that. So the Doolittle raid on Tokyo was mostly a great morale booster for us. Didn't do much damage, but it did convince the Japanese that their islands could be attacked. So they kept large numbers of fighters in Japan to defend against future attacks. And therefore, The Doolittle raid kept large numbers of Japanese fighters from being in the rest of the war. So it did have a good effect of scaring them. The Battle of the Coral Sea, I'll show you where the Coral Sea was before. Come on now. The Battle of the Coral Sea was actually, militarily, it was a draw. The Japanese were going to come down and land on New Guinea, and we had broken their code, and we knew they were coming down, and we went out to meet them, but we didn't have any real radar, and there were many times it was a very confused battle. Let me just put it that way. Sometimes we actually once we some B-17s that we had in the Australia came out, and what did they attack? But two U.S. ships, but they missed both of them, so they didn't do any damage. But they did attack our own ships. The Japanese were so confused, they sent out reconnaissance planes which found the U.S. ships, but they called in the wrong coordinates for where they were. So the Japanese Navy was operating against wrong coordinates for where we were. And we were also confused about where they were. So it was we finally found each other, and there was weather in there that some of the Japanese carriers hid under. But anyway, the Japanese lost one carrier, and we lost one, and the Lexington was hit so badly and was smoking so badly, the Japanese reported they had lost it. But they hadn't. They put out the fires and got the darn thing back to Honolulu, Pearl Harbor, where those undamaged facilities, the best in the world, had several days to work on putting the Lexington back into order and getting it out to battle in the time for the Battle of Midway. The Yorktown. Yeah. Yes, you're right. The Lexington was sunk down there. And it was Yorktown that got back. So thank you for that correction. The Japanese then, they had two carriers, one small one sunk, a very old one, the Soho, and two of their main fleet carriers were hit. Well, one of them was only hit lightly, but it lost most of its fighters, most of its planes in the battles. And the other one was hit pretty heavily, but still had most of its fighters and pilots. Well, they both went back to Japan for repairs. And here the Japanese command structure, hurt them. The Japanese considered the planes on a carrier to be attached to the carrier, where the Americans thought of our squadrons as being separate groups that could be sent to any carrier. So now the Japanese had two ships in Japan. One had pilots and planes, but was heavily damaged and needed repairs. And the other one wasn't damaged that badly, but didn't have any pilots or planes. But the Japanese organization was such that they couldn't transfer the planes from the lightly damaged ship to the one that had lost all its planes. So both Japanese carriers were tied up in Japan while they were fixing these different problems. And so remember when they attacked on Pearl Harbor, they had 6 carriers. Well, now they only had 4 carriers. And the Lexington had not been, Lexington had been sunk. So it was Yorktown, which got back to Honolulu and was turned around. And so we now had 3 aircraft carriers. And the Japanese had 4 for the Battle of Midway. So the odds were much closer at the Battle of Midway if the Japanese had switched their planes to the other carrier. They would have had 5 carriers, and we had 3. The Battle of Midway might have turned out much differently. So that is how the Battle of the Coral Sea affected the Battle of Midway. So in the Battle of Midway was the turning point of the war, and I spent the rest of the war in Honolulu, and at the end of the war, we took a family photo. We had a bomb shelter at our place, and we had our family. This was going to be our Christmas card picture. Now, it was, in those days, camera timers were fairly new, but my father, working for Kodak, of course, he had set up a tripod with a timer on it, and we all took our positions, and Bob was somewhere behind me, but that's me with the for rent sign and the hammer in my hand, and Bob was supposed to be back there with me, but the time went for the timer, he thought, and he said it didn't go off. So he goes walking up there to see why the darn timer didn't go off. And then it went off and caught him here, but he shows some good, he was barefoot. So was my sister, you can't see it so well. We were barefoot most of the time in Honolulu. Most of the time we were barefoot. He is carrying a gas mask. We were afraid of gas attacks, and we were issued gas masks. And I remember we used one of them once to paint our floor. But there we were in our bomb shelter at the end of the war. We were closing it down. So, any questions?